Our speaker is going to speak about atheism in literature. She received her doctorate from Yale in theater and dramatic criticism. She taught at George Washington University, the University of Virginia, and the University of Notre Dame. She is a playwright, several plays to her credit, including The $1 Billion Saint, 7 Nuns South of the Border. The most famous one is 7 Nuns at Las Vegas. She writes a weekly column, The Short View for the Wanderer. I present to you, Nattalie, Dr. Nattalie White.
Thank you very much, Mr. Courtney and friends. You're a difficult man to follow. All that humor and everything. I'm going to cut everything short now and get right into my speech. I'm glad to be in Boston, and it's hard for a Virginian to say that. I'm talking about atheism in literature, which has a rather negative title, and my first point is going to be negative. Please don't panic. Most of the speech will be on the positive side because I'm a very positive kind of person. I want to read you a comment by Eddie Albee, a playwright who has recently had a play called Tiny Alice produced on Broadway, which seemed to have puzzled the critics and the people who went to see it. Some of the critics in an interview asked him what it was about, and he said, quote, "The play was written out of a certain conviction about what I am not sure, but written with a certain emotional and perhaps intellectual intensity." Now, I cannot give you any better idea of what is going on in the literary and dramatic world than that. Here is a man who has a play produced on Broadway with some of the finest actors in the English-speaking world, including Sir John Gielgud, and he himself confesses he doesn't know what he wrote. Now, I can read you from his preface to a short play called The American Dream, and in that I can sum up exactly what is wrong with literature today. In the preface to The American Dream, he says, quote, "Is the play offensive? I certainly hope so. It was my intention to offend, as well as amuse and entertain. Is it nihilist, immoral, defeatist? Well, to that, let me answer that. The American Dream is a picture of our time as I see it, of course. Every honest work is a personal, private yowl, a statement of one individual's pleasure or pain," unquote. Now, there you have in summary exactly what a work of art is not. For at least 2,400 years, art has been first communication. Now, by a slight bit of trickery, we are told that art is self-expression. And when it is self-expression, you cannot criticize it. It is not communication any longer. The artist is not responsible for what he says because he is not talking to anybody, and if he has nothing to say, it doesn't matter. Now this runs through all forms of art. I'm going to talk primarily about literature, but I can give you an example that I use when I start teaching acting because I think it's graphic. I tell my students that want to study acting, if I sit in a corner and cry, I am expressing myself. But if I make you cry, I am acting. The end is to communicate the emotion. What I feel in the final analysis is immaterial. If I have no feeling myself, it is improbable that I will get any across to you. But the end is not what I feel, but what you feel. The end is not the idea that I have, but what I communicate to you. Now, if you'll fasten your mental seat belts, I'm going to give you a pretty hard couple of minutes because I want to back this up with some statements over the centuries and show you that up until the present time there has never been the slightest doubt about the fact that the artist's aim is to communicate. And this may shock you a little bit if you have been if you haven't looked beyond what people are saying today in the field of art. The purpose of the communication has always been to make men better in some respect. Now you think about that in relation to what they are teaching the children in the schools today, and you'll see how far off the track we've gone. I want to take you quickly back to the Greeks. On what ground should a poet claim admiration? And the answer is, if he brings help to his nation by making men better in some respect. It is the duty of the poet, of the artist, to teach. As a child learns from all who come in his way, so the grown world learns from the poet. Now that idea has been carried on in criticism, in literary criticism, right through the centuries, right down, as a matter of fact, to the Reader's Digest, June 1965, where Dame Edith Sitwell has an article, a reprint from 1955, which I urge you to read. I won't quote it now because you can get hold of it, in which she says that the poet is also like the priest to inspire men. If you come down to the Elizabethan era, to the period 1590, Sir Philip Sidney wrote about poetry, and he said, poetry therefore is an art of imitation with this end, to teach and to delight. Skip a century, John Dryden, a play ought to be for the delight and instruction of mankind. Samuel Johnson, another century later, says the end of writing is to instruct. The end of poetry is to instruct by pleasing. Come down to William Wordsworth, and he says, and this you probably know, poetry is the breath and finer spirit of all knowledge. Think about that. That is the object of poetry. Matthew Arnold, who wrote at length about literature, said, poetry is at bottom a criticism of life. It is an answer to the question how to live. A poetry of revolt against moral ideas is a poetry of revolt against life. A poetry of indifference to moral ideas is a poetry of indifference toward life. And in another passage, Matthew Arnold picks up a phrase that Jonathan Swift uses in his Battle of the Books. Swift says that there are certain writers who are like spiders, who give us dirt and poison, and there are others who are like bees that fill us with honey and wax. And then I quote Swift, he says, thus furnishing mankind with the two noblest of things, which are sweetness and light. And Matthew Arnold picks up that phrase and says, the pursuit of perfection, then, is the pursuit of sweetness and light. He who works for sweetness and light works to make reason and the will of God prevail. That has been, in brief, the attitude of critics toward art, toward literary art, toward poetry, toward drama. And while I am not familiar with the other fields, I think you will find a great deal of it carrying over there. I will read you one more quotation, and then I will get off this topic. And that is Walter Pater writing in 1889, not so much about the morality of art, but about art itself, its essence. And this is a quotation which I like because I get so angry when people say the form of the thing doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how you express yourself. If it's a yowl, okay. Listen to Pater. He's saying the literary contention is not of one school of literary art against another, but of all successive schools alike, against the stupidity which is dead to the substance, and the vulgarity which is dead to form. And we get so much vulgarity. Our children are getting so much vulgarity of form. Now I want to switch over to some examples of different kinds of literature. And I'll give you some examples from tragedy. And I'll quote to begin with from the general introduction to the complete Greek drama, edited by Whitney J. Oates and Eugene O'Neill Jr. These men studied Greek drama, and they summed up the three things that are necessary to all great tragedy. Now, one thing I think should be clear in your minds about all criticism is that the critics do not write the rules. They simply study and analyze what works and what doesn't. And they found out this, that there are three basic assumptions of tragedy. First, the dignity of man. Second, the freedom of his will and his responsibility for the use which he makes of that will. And third, the existence in the universe of a superhuman factor. Without those three things, you cannot have great tragedy. And I want to read you a short passage from a Greek tragedy and then a somewhat similar passage from a modern American drama. This is from Agamemnon by Aeschylus, and it's the scene where Agamemnon comes back triumphant from the Trojan wars and is greeted by his wife Clytemnestra. Agamemnon, to get a fair wind for Troy, had sacrificed their daughter Iphigenia to the gods, and Clytemnestra feels that she must avenge that death, and she has been waiting 10 years for this vengeance. She has prepared a great purple tapestry for him to walk on. And listen to her words to him. Now to me, dear beloved, down from your car, but not on common earth shall your foot rest, my king, the foot that trod Troy into dust. She turns to her women and she says, you women to your task, why this delay? Cover the ground before him as I gave order. Spread fair tapestries, straightway with purple let his path be paved. And the women bring this purple tapestry down the steps of the palace out to the chariot. And Agamemnon shrinks back. Cover my path? That would draw down upon me God's jealousy, to whom alone belongs such honor. For a mortal man to walk on costly fineries is cause for dread. I tell you, honor me as man, not God. And Clytemnestra stands there before the townsfolks, and she pleads with him, she argues with him. Would Priam have done this? Would he have refused to walk on purple had he won? And finally, the situation becomes so tense, so embarrassing, that Agamemnon agrees, although he is fearful of committing the Greek sin of hubris, of making himself one with the gods. And he says, finally, you would have me yield, you would be victor over me. And she says, yes, yield to me. And as he starts to step down from the car, she adds, but of your own free will. She doesn't just want to kill him. She wants to damn him. And that adds a height, another dimension to the tragedy. And he steps on to the purple. He commits this sin of hubris, of walking as a god walks into the palace. And Clytemnestra follows him, and at the door she stops and turns and looks toward the temple and says, God, God, fulfillment is with thee. Fulfill my prayer. That which shall be fulfilled in thy care rests. and she turns and goes into the palace. This is what Milton calls gorgeous tragedy in sceptred Paul. Now let us turn from that to a modern American play which won the Critics' Circle Award, the Pulitzer Prize Award, and has been called by many people the greatest of American plays. It is by Arthur Miller. It is The Death of a Salesman. Here is a scene in which a woman is talking to her two sons about her husband's death, his attempt at suicide. Linda is the mother, Biff and Happy are the sons. Linda speaks first. This scene, incidentally, is not in a palace. It is in a kitchen. And Linda says, "He's dying, Biff." And Biff says, after a pause, "Why is he dying?" And Linda says, "He's been trying to kill himself." And Biff says, with great horror, "How?" And Linda says, "I live from day to day." And Biff says, "What are you talking about?" And she says, "Last month," with great difficulty. Oh, boys, it's so hard to say a thing like this. "I was looking for a fuse. The lights blew out, and I went down the cellar. And behind the fuse box, it happened to fall out, was a length of rubber pipe," and she holds it up just short. And Happy says, "No kidding." And Linda says, "There's a little attachment on the end of it. I knew right away. And sure enough, on the bottom of the water heater, there's a new little nipple on the gas pipe." And Happy says angrily, "That jerk." That is tragedy without the dimensions. Let me give you another comparison, and I will make this one very brief because you're all familiar with it. The greatest murder story ever written is Macbeth, of course. And you know the scene, the greatest scene of murder, which incidentally takes place off stage in this greatest of murder plays. Macbeth comes on, and he has blood on his hands, the blood of the man he's murdered. And he doesn't speak of the murder at first. He said that one of the grooms cried, "God bless us," and the other said, "Amen." And when I tried to say amen, it stuck in my throat, but I had most need of prayer. The moment he kills, he is cut off. He cannot speak, he cannot pray. And then he looks down at his bloody hands, and he stands stunned, as in his mind he sees these bloody hands dipped into the sea. And he says, "Will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hands? No, this my hand will rather the multitudinous seas incarnadine, making the green one red." Now, that is one of the most powerful scenes in drama. I want to turn from that to a scene by a playwright who is considered by many the greatest of American playwrights, Eugene O'Neill. And I choose him particularly at this time because our government is honoring him as it has never honored any other playwright. It is putting Eugene O'Neill on a postage stamp. It is putting him on a postage stamp and taking off Patrick Henry. You know, that old "give us liberty or give us death" business is passé now, so we're having Eugene O'Neill. This is from a play called Morning Becomes Electra, and it's a very brief conversation, a very brief scene here between Orrin, who is telling his mother that he has just killed her lover. And here is the way he breaks the news to her. He says, "Your warning was no use." And she says chokingly, "What? Tell me." And he says, I killed him. And she says with a cry of terror, oh, I knew. No, Orrin, you're just telling me that to punish me, aren't you? You couldn't murder. And Orrin says, you could murder father, couldn't you? And he thrusts the newspaper into her hand and points to the story and says, here, read that if you don't believe it. We got it to see whom the police would suspect. Now that is a very bad scene technically for drama. Here is a man who has just killed a man. He has no words to say to convince anyone that he has killed him. Here is the forerunner of all those television and movie heroes who bang, bang, bang kill people and no expression ever crosses their face on it. Here is the beginning of that kind of thing. And he has to give her a newspaper and let her read it in the newspaper. He has no way of expressing nothing has happened to him because he's killed a man. And incidentally, I cut something out of that line because I didn't want to get a laugh maybe in the middle of it. The line actually reads, read that if you don't believe me. We got it in Boston to see whom the police would suspect. So murder in Boston, I did not want to bring that into the middle of it. How long have I been talking? Excuse me.
Almost 25 minutes.
Oops, all right. I'm going to cut a little bit of this here, except I want to point out this to you, and this is very important. I want to go back for a moment to the character of Macbeth. What kind of man is Shakespeare's Macbeth, who stands stunned in horror at the blood on his hands? It is very important that you remember that Macbeth is a soldier, that when he is introduced to us in the play, he is called not valiant, but valor's minion, the favorite of the god of valor. He is called Bellona's bridegroom, the bridegroom of the goddess of war. And his sword is smoking blood, bloody execution. This is in defense of his king, of his country. He is a great soldier, and yet when he sees the blood of a murdered man on his hands, he is stunned and imagines that they will turn all the waters, all the green seas red from that. Now, I mention that to you because it's important that you make that distinction. When our students read this kind of thing, it should seep into them that there is a difference between war and murder. So often we have these sob stories, about somebody who kills a half a dozen people, and they said, I was a soldier, they gave me a gun, I went bang, bang, and they're still going bang, bang. Macbeth will teach you differently. It is the artist's purpose to teach as well as to delight. Now, as my time is running along, I want to switch over to something about this reality. So much of what is being taught our children is said to be because of reality. They must face reality. They get so much blasphemy, so much profanity in the language, and they say this is the way real people talk. And so they must get their art real. I wonder how many of you realize that one of Shakespeare's greatest plays opens with the word tush. Very few people even notice it. Tush, never tell me, I take it much unkindly, that thou, Iago, who hast my purse as if the strings were thine, shouldst know of this. This is Roderigo talking to Iago in Othello, and Roderigo is not the kind of man who would say tush, and Iago is not the kind of man to whom one would say tush. How did it happen? Well, the play was printed after 1606, and in 1606, the English passed a law which forbade profanity on the stage. It forbade taking the name of the Lord in vain and all blasphemy. Even such oaths as zounds, God's blood, which may have been used here, was eliminated. Now, If you will imagine for a moment what would happen to our literature if we were to pass such a law, but don't worry, it can't happen here. This play by Eddie Albee, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, which got the Drama Critics Circle and Tony Awards of the year, would read like this, and I think you would notice it. Tush, shh, H-tush. For tush's sake, Martha, it's 2 o'clock, oh, George, blah, 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 but 3 or 4 more lines more. Who's it from? For tush's sake. I haven't the faintest idea. Dumbbell, it's from some Tush Betty Davis picture, some Tush Warner Brothers epic. I can't remember all the pictures. Nobody's asking you to remember every single Tush Warner Brothers epic. Believe me, if the Tushes were put into most of our modern drama, you would know it. Now, I want to go back to Shakespeare for a moment and this whole question of reality. Literature, drama, is an imitation of life, and the same principle should apply. People who are concerned about drama want reality, and I'm going to develop this a little further. We do not expect art to have no evil in it, because it would be false. There is evil in the world. In the 19th century, there was some criticism of Shakespeare on the idea that he was perhaps a little vulgar, that he did write about things that maybe people should not write about. And there rose to a defense of his realism Coleridge, the critic, the poet Coleridge. And he wrote of Shakespeare's plays something that I wish I could impress on every critic. Keeping at all times in the high road of life, Shakespeare has no innocent adulteries, no interesting incests, no virtuous vice, never renders that amiable religion and reason alike teach us to detest, or clothes impurity in the garb of virtue. He never injures the mind, nor carries on welfare against virtue, by causing wickedness to appear as no wickedness through the medium of a morbid sympathy with the unfortunate. In Shakespeare, vice never walks as in twilight. Nothing is purposely out of its place. He inverts not the order of nature. He has no benevolent butchers, nor any sentimental rat catchers. And we have too many in our literature. Too often we have, through the morbid sympathy with the unfortunate, notice the carefully chosen word morbid, we make wickedness appear as no wickedness. Now, I have been mentioning these things. The speech is, of course, brief for what I'm trying to cover, but I am aiming it, I am thinking about it in terms of what we are teaching our children in school. Literature teaches, as the Greeks said, the grown-ups, it also teaches children. And through literature, we get our reactions, we feel things. We learn not only with our minds, we learn with our spirits, with our bodies, and with our emotions. And we get up. We get emotional reflexes. They work both ways, but if you've ever tried pure logic, I've got 15 minutes, oh goody. If you ever tried pure logic in an argument with somebody who is using emotional reflexes, you know what I'm talking about. They just know a thing is true. It's a part of them. And logic, the mind doesn't reach them. Now I want to quote another critic, Ed Fisher. In 1962, he expresses this very well. There are many levels of realization. Often we have information in our heads, but are not saturated with it. The theologian can put things into our heads, but sometimes it takes an artist to make us realize those things all the way to the roots of our souls. And that is what literature, the right kind of literature, does, so that we have reactions that seem to be instinctive to certain things as they come up. I want to give you a personal example of an emotional reaction, a reaction that just it went down deep in the roots of my own being. The first time one of my liberal school teacher's friends presented me with the specious logic on teaching children through these terrible, profane, and obscene things that are written today, I was too stunned to answer her. And she kept on arguing, and I just shook my head. It's wrong, it's wrong, it's wrong. I couldn't say. I couldn't think. But I knew it was wrong. Then when I went home, I began thinking, and mentally, ideas began to come. And I realized that in high school and later in college, and many times since, I had read some lines of Alexander Pope, with which I'm sure you're all familiar. Vice is a monster of so frightful mien as to be hated needs but to be seen. Yet seen too oft, familiar with her face, we first endure, then pity, then embrace. And that had become a part of me, so that I had an instinctive reaction. But that is a satire. It is not an emotional bit of work, and my reaction went very, very deep. Somehow or another, I was horrified at the thought of teachers standing up in a classroom and holding up before minds, young minds, innocent minds, all this ugliness and evil. And then one day I happened to see a paperback mythology, and on the front of it is a drawing of Perseus holding up the head of the Medusa. Do you all remember that fable of mythology? Perseus is sent to get the head of the Gorgon, this woman who is so ugly, her hair is snakes, that if a human being looks at her, he is turned to stone. And Perseus cannot do this by himself. He has the help of two gods, Hermes and Athena. And he has 5 magic aids. He has a cap that makes him invisible so that the Gorgon cannot see him. He has winged sandals. He has a wallet into which he can put the head that will come down on it, that will receive anything that's put in it and clamp down on it. He has a magic sword to go through, and he has also the shield of the goddess Athena, the bronze shield, so that when he goes to kill this ugly creature, so ugly and so evil that the sight of it turns a man to stone, he does not look at it. He sees it only reflected in the shield, and that's how he kills it. And he brings it back to present to the man who had sent him off to it, to his enemy, and he raises up the head of the Medusa, and the whole assembly is turned to stone. And it seemed to me then that I realized why I was so horrified at the thought of teachers in the classroom holding up to children this ugliness and this evil, because they're turning our children to stone. They're turning their minds to stone. They're turning their bodies to stone, and they're turning their hearts to stone. And if you don't believe it, try to talk to some of these children who have been so indoctrinated. Try to talk to them of the suffering that is going on in the world today, and you'll find they do not have compassion because their hearts have been turned to stone. Now, I want to wind up by saying this. All these people who are telling you that they are realist are not realist at all. All these obscene and profane and pornographic little writers who think they're realist are, in a way, rather pathetic. They remind me of obscene little Buddhas sitting there contemplating their own nakedness and not knowing what is going on in the world today. And yet there are writers, there are men of literature, there are prophets and poets who are telling us what is going on in the world today, who are crying out to us. Truth cries out in the streets and no man regards it. E. Merrill Root has a beautiful book of poetry called A Perilous Seas, in which he speaks about these illusions and the necessity of facing reality. And just recently I've been reading a book by a man who has suffered in this century in a peculiar way, and through his suffering he has learned what the Greeks say that we learn from suffering, and that is wisdom. I'm speaking of Cold Friday by Whittaker Chambers. And in this, he tells us that we must come to grips with the reality of the world around us today. And he says we are entering the naked years. And what dismays us is the reluctance at this time to face reality exactly as it is. And the reality, of course, that we must face is the fact that 800 million souls are living under communism. 800 million souls are living in slavery, in a kind of degradation that is beyond all imagination, all history. And he says we must realign our thinking, we must come to grips with life in terms of that reality. We must hope, not that we can contain them or contain what they live for, but we must define hope in terms of what is going to happen, of the reality. And he reduces hope to a quotation by a communist, a man who has been a communist throughout, and he said that suddenly this man rose up and made this statement: if the whole world were to be covered with asphalt, one day a crack would appear in the asphalt, and in that crack grass would grow. And Whittaker Chambers says we cannot reduce hope any further than that. That is what we may all have to face. That is hope as we have it from a communist. I would like to give you the same idea exactly by a poet of the 19th century. And it's strange how many poets, how many literary figures of the 19th century seem to have been standing on the brink of our lives when they wrote. This is a religious poet, and he gives us reality as hard and fast as you will ever get it. The same image, really, as the communist. But listen, this is Gerard Manley Hopkins, religious writer. Generations have trod, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge and shares man's smell. The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod. And for all this, nature is never spent. There lives the dearest freshness deep down things. And though the last lights off the black west wet, oh, morning at the brown brink eastward springs, because the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods with warm breast and with bright wings. Thank you.